I want to remind you that we love questions. I will throw all of your questions to our panelists, whether they're prepared for them or not. So halfway through, I'll take one or two, and we reserve the final 10 minutes for questions as well. So please come ready with your questions. Today, we'll be talking about the brutal and archaic practice of trapping, whether that's for commercial or agricultural purposes. We've got a great group, a great panelist here with me today to discuss this issue are two Montanans and two New Mexicans. One of those Montanans is Betsy Brandborg. She's an attorney and a longtime advocate for wildlife and wildlands. Zack Strong, also a Montanan, is a senior staff attorney with the Animal Welfare Institute. Charlotte Madueño is a Norteño, a longtime resident of northern New Mexico. She's a community advocate and consultant. And also joining me is our very own Chris Smith, who is Guardians Southern Rockies wildlife advocate. Welcome to you all. It's great to have you. Before we get into the main topic, I'm wondering if each of you could briefly introduce yourselves by sharing something personally or professionally in 15, 20, 30 seconds. Why don't we have Betsy go first, and then Charlotte, and then Zack, and then Chris. Just something that illuminates who you are as a person.
Alrighty, I've been general counsel for the State Bar of Montana, the outfit that regulates lawyers, for 25 years. So I've known Zack's father before he was a judge, and I got to know a lot of the judiciary and most of the lawyers because I teach programs for lawyers. So I'm connected that way. But the way I'm connected to this world is through my parents and grandparents. My dad was part of the 1964 Wilderness Act and was the reason there was such a thing as grassroots organizing. And so that's my background. And then the trapping issue has come in as part of my life.
We'll get to that. Charlotte?
Hey everybody, my name is Charlotte Madueño. I am from Dixon, New Mexico, which is just south of Taos on the Colorado borderline. And personally, I am a community organizer. I am very fortunate to live in the beautiful high desert area with lots of mountains, streams, hiking, wild animals, hunting. All of that is all accompanied in where I live. Professionally, I'm a consultant. I am a campaign manager. I campaign Democratic candidates, those who align with general Democratic standards. Although I must say I focus a lot on progressives, and I also focus on preservation of hunting and being responsible when in the mountains, climate change, all of those things, all of those that should be near and dear to all of us. That's something that I really focus on professionally.
Thank you, Charlotte. How about you, Zack?
Hey everyone, thanks John. I'm really glad to be here. I'm Zack Strong. As John said, I'm here in Bozeman, Montana. And I'm actually a fifth generation Montanan. I grew up doing many of the sort of traditional Montana things, hunting and fishing. Actually worked on a cattle ranch in the summers and in high school. And I haven't done many of those things for a long time, but I'm really glad to have had that experience in my background. And I think it brings a lot to and helps inform my advocacy on behalf of animals today.
Thank you, Zack. How about you, Chris?
Hey, John, thank you for having me. I grew up also in northern New Mexico. I have 5 generations who are either buried or living here. And, you know, my family doesn't have any land. So public landscapes were a big part of my upbringing. And I've kind of come to see the world through a lens of protecting biodiversity to ensure that the beauty that I experienced growing up, seeing wildlife, playing and enjoying diverse ecosystems, is there for my nieces, my great nephew, and future generations. And so that's why I do this work. It's actually for people, but I really think protecting wildlife and biodiversity and the ecosystems that we live in is critical to that.
I thank you, Chris. I love that we've got the Rockies covered, from the two of you here in the Southern Rockies, the Sangre de Cristos, to the two of you up in Montana. We've got the continental scale, which speaks to, unfortunately, the scale of the problem that we're grappling with as well. I wanted to start with stories because I feel like stories shape our consciousness and can move us to take action that we otherwise might not take, be more courageous when we hear people's stories. And I wanted to start with you, Charlotte. I know earlier this winter you had what I imagine was a very unsettling experience involving your dogs. Could you share what happened?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me speak on this issue. Well, it was a normal day. My dog are inside and outside dogs. I should let you know they're all 3 German Shepherds, very big dogs, very hard to contain, although we do have a fence around our property. They can sometimes get out, and we live near a river, so it's not really that concerning because sometimes they go and splash around and come home. However, I let them out. They got out of our gate, friendly dogs. And so they came home. 2 of them came home and 1 did not. And I was really worried because she is the responsible dog. She's the one that always you call and she comes. And I was really worried about her. It was very late. I looked around our property to see maybe she got hurt because I live on an acre, and I went looking for her and I couldn't find her. And my husband's a firefighter, so he was not home that night. It was myself and my 3 kids. I have a son, James, who is 9, a son, Isaiah, who is 7, and a daughter, Ayana, who is 3. So the next morning I woke up and they still weren't home, and I was really, really concerned. So I went around and, I was calling for her. I went through my whole town, called neighbors. We all know each other, and we're all very friendly. She didn't come home that morning, and that was about 7 o'clock. We had a really bad storm that night that covered everything. It covered any chance of seeing tracks, and any means of finding her. So my husband came home about 9 o'clock off of shift, and I called him. I was worried. My kids were worried, and he drove in. He was ready to, load everyone up and go give an extensive look around the area. And he saw her dragging her hind legs behind her, and he saw something poking out of her neck, and he slammed the brakes, scooped her up in the truck, and realized it was a snare. He put her in the truck, drove her home, yanked her inside, and we frantically started a really, terrible time for us, but we were panicking, trying to save her life. Her eyes were bulging out of her head. They were bloodshot, and she fought every ounce of herself to get free from that snare. She broke that snare wire to get home because she knew we would do everything we possibly could to save her. It was very traumatic, as you can tell. It was very traumatic for my young kids to see. That's their family pet. They love her. We all love her. And so it was scary, and I would have not been able to set her free, because that snare is very, with a pair of needle nose, which is what we had, it's very hard for myself to have the strength to be able to cut through that wire. My husband, thank God he was here. He's much stronger than I am. And even as he stuck the snares in to cut, we suppressed her breathing. You could hear her stop breathing because it was so tight. We pulled it off of her, and she just gasped for air. It was scary. When people say the pets are like your family, they really truly are, especially to a young family with young kids watching this unfold in front of their eyes. Now she very much sticks close to home, thankfully, but it was a very traumatic experience for my entire family. And I just am very lucky that my husband was able to see her. So naturally with fresh snow, as a hunter, as we're all hunters, my husband and I and my family going back generations, responsible hunters, responsible hunters. We tracked her. We wanted to know where she came from with that fresh snowfall, right? Because that's where we got to go back to. We were scared somebody trapped her at their house. We just didn't know. So we went back and followed her into the BLM land where her tracks got sketchy. And then we were already on BLM land, so we knew what that meant from there on. There was somebody in our area trapping.
Yeah.
As I've mentioned before, I live in Dixon. It's a very thriving community, very outdoorsy. And so it really opened my eyes. You know, my kids and I, we run out into the BLM all the time without any trails or anything like that, not even worrying at the top of our within our scope that this may happen to us, to any of us, people or animals or anything.
Yep.
And I was very distraught, and there was a bill passing in my legislature. As I mentioned, I work right now in the legislature, and there was a trapping bill. So I immediately reached out and offered to lend my support of my story to these legislators that were trying to get this bill passed. I wanted to real quickly, since this story is not completely about me, they get me. I wanted to give you just a quick glimpse of Ceniza. She's here and happy, and we're very lucky that she's around still.
Wow. Wow. Well, I'm sorry that you had to
Thank you.
experience such a traumatic event. I'm curious, before I get to you, Betsy, so you can share your story. Charlotte, had you had any awareness or experience with traps or snares prior to this experience? Did you, not in terms of your pets, but were you aware of the practices and that they were legal on public land?
I was very aware of it. I do know, and we do have lots of coyotes, so I know it's a very big issue here. However, I didn't experience the inhumanity, the inhumane way of how this is done until I saw it from my own eyes.
Yeah.
And of course, it really, something that traumatic really opens your eyes to other things and other experiences other individuals are having as well. And this is just a really big problem here in my area. Several instances after mine have come up. Every week there's about 2 different animals that are missing. We're reaching out, telling them to go into the BLM to look around. And that's very heartbreaking. I would have been heartbroken if somebody had to mention that to me. Although I would have been grateful, it would have been very heartbreaking to know that that could have been where my pet could be found.
Yeah, yeah. Well, again, thank you for coming and having the courage to share your story and the courage to get activated on this issue. I want to reassure our participants that while we are sharing some stories that are hard to hear, we are going to talk about reasons for being hopeful, and we are going to give you opportunities to take action, because that's what this is all about. So, Betsy, I know you've had personal experiences, but prior to the start of this, you shared really briefly, but incredibly poignantly, a story about your parents. I'm wondering if you could share that story and then your own story as well.
Well, my dad was a wildlife biologist in Idaho and in Montana, and I'm a fourth generation Zack. Kids are 5th generation Montanan. And just to put everything in context, Montana has 1 million people and about 5,000 trappers. Anyway, the bear trap behind the 2, Chris and John's head, brought to mind a terrible story that my parents told us that broke their hearts. And it breaks mine and yours, I'm sure, that they were out, and my parents didn't travel with guns, and they were often on horseback in wild places. And they came upon a meadow, and there was a bear in a trap with a second bear. And the bear in the trap was crying, and the second bear would go back and hug the bear in the trap, and then they would cry, and then they would separate, and then they would get together in a trap, or get and hug. They just kept hugging. Phew.
I know.
So that, and they couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
So my story is just about hearing my dog. I have a very stoic Airedale who died of old age just this last summer. So it's okay. But because she's an Airedale and her job was to protect me in a very wild place, because that's where we live. We're bordering on tens of thousands of acres of wild land around where I live. And actually, it's got one of the biggest wolverine populations in the lower 48 because there's a contingent, we're not too awfully far away from Glacier. Anyway, we go out into the wildlands all the time, but because traps are permitted 50 feet from the center line of a road or a trail, the dog's sniffing around and doing what dogs do and whammo. And the first time she got trapped, I was with a girlfriend. It was her birthday and the trap was in a campground.
Wow.
And the sounds that came from that animal haunted me so completely because Airedales are the most stoic of dogs. I've pulled porcupine quills out of her nose and she doesn't say a peep, but it was pretty awful. And because I knew traps, I was able to get her out. And of course, it was a bobcat set, so there were multiple traps right around where she was. I reported it to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks instantly. They didn't bother to investigate for a month. By the time they got out there, the trapper had cleaned up the mess. And I was accused of having stolen the trap, and law enforcement was very aggressive about it. It's a handy thing to be a lawyer sometimes. And so then not too long after that, we had 3 different trapping incidents in less than 5 years with the same dog with traps, except for the one that was in the campground, which they never did anything about. The other 2 were quote unquote legal traps. They were within 50 feet of a trail or road. So we decided we'd never go in that area again during the winter time. We went to a different area, and on Christmas Eve, she got trapped again. This time there were like 3 or 4 more traps. I heard it. I knew the sounds because it was a sound like none other. It's just terror. It's just terror and dog voice. And if you heard your kid making those sounds, you would just be chilled. And you don't know what the sound is. It doesn't sound like anything you know. And fortunately, I have a very athletic son. He got to her. When we got there, there were 3 other traps. I said, let's snap those because we had 2 other dogs with us. There's pandemonium. They're going to get in one. We got her out, limped home. That was Christmas Eve. The trapper, I sent word out on Footloose, and that trap disappeared. And what law enforcement came after me, hammer and tong. Again, handy to be a lawyer. 3rd trap, going to a completely different area, trying to find a safe area that's wild. I did not see the 4-wheeler, did not know of a 4-wheeler trail that kind of was parallel to where we were skiing. And that time I was with my friend's dogs too, so there were a lot of dogs. And it was a coyote trap, and the dogs, the boxer that was with the Airedale attacked the Airedale while she was in the trap. So we had double pandemonium and got her out. Each time, she's limping for a couple of days. Nothing broke except her teeth, where they mess their mouths up horribly while they're fighting, and they don't know what they're fighting, and there are traps all around. And that time, I'm self-reporting within 24 hours of each of these incidents. And in each instance, in that instance, law enforcement came after me saying that we destroyed the trap. When in fact, we left all the other traps unsnapped and just got the hell out of there, because once we got the dogs untangled and out, so that really reinforced my ability to engage with people. And I was helping the folk capture signatures for the initiative to ban trapping that failed miserably in Montana. And what was fascinating to me and wonderful about this particular webinar is that people didn't know, when I was capturing signatures, people didn't know trapping was a thing, and they didn't know it was legal. And then and they're like, why aren't there signs? And the worst sign, to the extent people do put up signs, it said predator control in the area. That doesn't mean anything to regular humans.
Yeah.
So finding safe public lands in Montana is a very difficult thing, even though in this enormous 4th largest state in the nation, we only have 5,000 trappers and they've taken over our public lands.
Yeah.
So I'm all about doing what we can to build a grassroots movement to make this stop.
Yeah. It's horrible to be the victim of one trapping incident, as Charlotte story attests to. You've not only had 3 incidents, Betsy, but there's intergenerational trauma. That bear story was,
That's terrible.
oh, it's a horrible story. And I'm doing my best to stay composed because it's just such a sad, sad thing, and speaks to the compassion that exists and the sentience that exists between animals. So thank you both for sharing those stories. Let's now inspire people with what we can do about this problem. And as a transition to that, I wanted to ask really, like, maybe Chris or Zack, give the audience a sense of, we've heard 2 stories, give the audience a sense of the scale and the scope of this problem across the West or even across the country. Just briefly, why don't you go, Chris, and then you, Zack, and if either one of the 2 of you, Betsy or Charlotte, have something to add, please chime in just to give folks a little more sense of the context.
Sure, I'm happy to give it a shot, and maybe Zack can fill in the gaps that I leave. But first of all, it's heart-wrenching to hear these stories, and I think these stories are important in understanding the scope, because I can speak really concretely to the scope here in New Mexico, the scale, which is, traps, snares, poisons, body crushing traps. Those are all legal across all of New Mexico's lands, with very few exceptions and very few restrictions at this point. And what that means is that we see about 12 to 13,000 animals killed every year by private trappers in the state. And that's just an astounding number. And different states have different regulations and, different climates and ecosystems and amounts of trappers. But it's, I think, pretty fair, except for the few states that have banned traps, to kind of think of that scale in nearly every Western state. And so each story that I hear from, Charlotte or from Betsy or from any number of people who have had these horrible encounters, that's playing out on the ground with native wildlife species thousands and thousands of times a year. And to me, that kind of articulates the scope and scale of the problem best. And again, there's nuances across the West in terms of how many animals are dying and how many people are having these encounters, but it's a massive problem, I think, and especially on public lands. Maybe Zack, you can talk about what's going on up further north, because I know that the situation's different there.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Unfortunately, it's pretty similar. Maybe three points to add to what you are saying about New Mexico. One is taking a step back. One major source of trapping, of course, is the federal government here in the U.S. As many of us know, the federal agency Wildlife Services kills around 100,000 native carnivores every year across the country, oftentimes using traps and snares, as well as another 20 to 30,000 beavers, often using traps. So that's unfortunately happening. Similar to New Mexico, just a few thousand trappers in Montana each year report killing around 30,000 animals. And that's just the reported numbers, because for most species that can be trapped in Montana, there is no reporting requirement. And then a third point to make is the impact that trapping has on non-target species. And again, just some numbers from Montana. In a recent 6-year stretch, the reported non-target animals caught in traps were around 350 animals. About 150 of those died And that included, kind of amazingly, 99 mountain lions, about 2/3 of which died. And so I think those kind of facts and figures make the point that trapping is a problem not only for the species that are targeted, but for species that aren't even supposed to be trapped in the first place.
Those facts and figures are staggering, really. And when you hear the stories and you allow those facts to kind of wave over you, it's just I don't know. It is difficult not to feel a lot of grief. So again, I want people to know that in a moment or two, I want to ask a couple more questions. We'll get to what's being done to ban trapping. I have two more questions, one of which I'm going to ask you, Chris, and then the other I'll ask you, Charlotte. So I've read poll after poll that say that most Americans, most voters in the West and across the country oppose trapping and snaring and poisoning. If that's true, why do we have this problem? Why is the public policy that exists so out of step with public sentiment?
That's a great question, John, and I'll try to give you an answer that's satisfactory, but I don't think it's going to really comfort you. I think public policy nearly always lags behind public sentiment, and unfortunately, especially progressive policies typically come way down the line after progressive values take hold. And furthermore, I think public lands policies, whether having to do with access or agriculture or extractive industries like oil and gas, those have been a major focus for narrow interest groups, I think. And so there's a level of entrenchment and agency capture that is really challenging to overcome when we seek to instill progressive policies. And so maybe I'll leave it at that. We're fighting powerful entrenched interests that consolidated power, 50 to 100 years ago, and captured state and federal agencies more or less, and we are having to work double time to overcome that situation.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. I have a question for you, Charlotte, from the perspective of your tradition as a hunter. And Zack and Chris and I were talking about this last week, and it relates to my question of Chris, which is this recognition about how challenging it is to achieve fundamental change on the practice of trapping. And we thought that some of this has to do with how effectively trappers have aligned themselves with hunters, asserting that, well, if you ban trapping, they're going to come for hunting next. As a hunter, Charlotte, how do you draw the distinction between hunting and trapping?
Thank you for that question. I have come from generations of hunting, and it was completely separate from trapping. They're not one and the same. I've never trapped, nor would I ever care to. It just, the way my father explained it, when we had this conversation about it, is we only hunt for food. We hunt for food. We hunt to fill our fridges and our bellies. That's it. Yeah. And when we do hunt, it is for me personally, it's very emotional, because I am not one to hurt an animal by any means. There's a ritual that we do when we hunt, which shows what I'm hoping that will show you, that we're very compassionate hunters. We give thanks to the animal. We give thanks to the creator that created the animal, because it's very much not a sport to us. It's a very embedded tradition that we hold very dear to our souls. On that note, trapping is not in any way, in my mind, a form of hunting. It's very sad, and it speaks to the people who trap, because they don't trap out of the necessity for food. They trap for the skin. They trap for whatever it is that they're selling, and it's all for profit. It's not at all to nourish the bodies, and which hunting was intended to. It was intended to nourish your bodies and to fill your freezers. And some different views on that, but that's how I was brought up, and that's how I'm bringing my children up.
Yep.
It's a very sacred tradition that we take part in, and trapping has no business into that sacred tradition of ours.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Zack, you grew up hunting. Anything to add to Charlotte's perspective just briefly? And then I want to get to an audience question as a transition.
Yeah, well, thanks for that response, Charlotte. I grew up hunting with my dad, who was, someone who I admire most in this world, and he taught me a couple of other things related to what Charlotte was saying. One is that the ethic around hunting, around responsible hunting, is to kill an animal as quickly and cleanly as possible and to avoid suffering. Whereas with trapping, the idea is you catch an animal in a steel device and let it languish there for hours or days, sometimes longer, until a trapper, it's convenient for them to come and remove the animal and finally kill it if it hasn't already died from other causes by then. So that to me is a dramatic difference. And then just one other thought is that responsible hunting does not pose much of a threat to non-target animals. An elk hunter is unlikely to accidentally kill a wolverine or an eagle or someone's family pet, whereas with traps, that's very much a concern, and they very much pose that danger to those non-target species.
Yep. Thanks for adding that, Zack. We could spend more time talking about the nature of the problem, horror stories, and trauma. We're going to shift the conversation now, spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about what is being done and what needs to be done, all of which I'd like to think are reasons to feel hopeful about our ability to change this practice. I want to get to a question from a panelist, and then we'll get back to the questions that we've had, that I have. What action can we, this is from Linda Kemp. Thank you, Linda. What action can we take on a national scale to end trapping? There was a bill, she says, HB 8828, to end the sale of traps. I don't know if this bill is going to be reintroduced. Do you have information on this bill or other bills to help end trapping? You want to take that, Zack?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for the question. So a couple thoughts. One is a quick update on federal legislation. You're right that was the Public Safety and Wildlife Protection Act that was introduced last congressional session, has not been reintroduced yet, but could be, along with a couple of others. One that Animal Welfare Institute has worked on in the past and is it's very much top of our minds currently, is called the Refuge from Cruel Trapping Act, which would prohibit the use of the sort of worst traps, the leg hold traps, snares, and conibear traps on wildlife refuges. My colleagues in our government affairs department, and I know many other groups too, are currently reaching out to legislative offices to figure out who might be sponsors and co-sponsors of those pieces of legislation. And as far as what people can do, I really strongly encourage people to reach out to their state and federal legislators. It makes a difference. Relatively few people do it. And I think it's even more compelling, probably a lot more compelling, for our elected officials to hear from members of the public, as opposed to paid advocates like me, who they're hearing from all the time already. And so I really, strongly encourage people to do that.
Yep. Thank you, Zack. I'm going to hand a question to you, Chris, in a moment, and maybe you can add to it, Charlotte. But I want to note that the chat box is blowing up. I'm going to do my best to keep up with it. But one of the things that I love about sharing stories is that it inspires other people to share stories. And I'm seeing one from Patricia Flood here, who writes to you, Betsy, that as a child, she found a blue jay in a trap. But then she also describes finding a skunk in a trap and rescuing it. And it being worth stinking for 3 days. So I thought that was cute to share. Thank you, Patricia, for your courage and enduring 3 days of skunk smell. So, Chris, what are the prospects for banning trapping on public lands in New Mexico? I know we're in the legislative session, and we're all curious to hear about where things stand.
Sure, thanks for asking that. And as many people who are guardians know, banning traps across public lands in New Mexico has been a priority for us for years, and I thank everyone who's been involved in that effort to date. We currently have a bill in the legislature, Senate Bill 32, known as Roxys Law, which would ban traps, snares, and poisons on public lands in New Mexico. There's a lot of consternation from some of our supporters here in New Mexico who haven't heard an update on that bill recently. That bill is still alive and well. The legislature, as I'm sure Charlotte could speak to, is an esoteric and arcane and confusing beast, especially here in New Mexico. But that bill is alive. It's next headed to the Senate Judiciary Committee. We hope it gets a committee hearing soon. And after that, it'll be onto the Senate floor and then flip over to the House side. We remain hopeful that we can pass that legislation this year. It'll take some luck. It'll take a lot of hard work from all of our grassroots advocates across the state. But the prospects for hope are real here in New Mexico, that we could see the end to public lands trapping relatively soon. So I hope that answers your question, John, and I hope people will continue to stay engaged with that legislation because there's a lot of momentum behind it.
Anything to add to that, Charlotte?
Just one little piece of information. I think it's very important, as mentioned earlier, that if there is a bill within your state that is being passed, it's vital for senators and representatives to hear from their constituents. That's how they make their decisions, whether they're on one side of the spectrum or the other. If there's overwhelming support for something, generally they make the right decision constituents. So it's very important to email and call and activate that your base, your grassroots base, and let them know that these are ways that we can actually change the laws in our state to where it reflects our personal stands on these issues.
Thank you, Charlotte. I want to ask a question of the Montanans, but before I do, another question from the audience. This one's from Craig Gasser, and I'm not sure who's best to answer this, but I thought it'd be worth asking. If you could, one of you briefly answer, explain the different types of trap for the different kinds of animals. I'm clueless. Thank you for that vulnerable question, Craig.
Since my family has trapped, because my dad taught us trapping because he was out there saying, here's an activity. There are two types of traps that are still out there, and one's called a conibear. They're big rectangles, and the size of the rectangle is the size of the animal you're trying to get, but any animal can get into it. And it's the kind of trap you simply cannot remove your animal, your pet from. Your animal will die. They use that for beaver, wolves, but mostly beaver, muskrat, things like that. Then the other is the foothold trap. That's a bear trap behind the guys. That's big. You can't trap bear in Montana anymore, but they have leg hold traps are like that. And you see the two side pieces there. If your animal's in a trap, you push down on those two side pieces, and that'll give them some space to pull their leg out. And you have to be really careful because the dog will take your face off if you don't smush it with your body first. But the bottom line is the leg holds come in all sorts of sizes. And that's when they put one trap out, they never put one trap out. They always have a line of traps. You've heard the phrase trap lines. Well, they'll have a circle around a bait. And in Montana, they're supposed to keep the raptors out, make a little shelter so that the raptor won't go in, but that doesn't stop them. So those are the types and they range from from smaller things for martin. They use a little tiny conibear, but they also use leg holds, and they're out there. But the thing that we haven't talked about is snares.
Mhm.
And when I was attending Zack Strong's Trapping Advisory Commission, and I hope he talks a little bit about that, one of the trappers that was sitting next to me was bragging to another trapper that he just finished putting 100 snares in a creek bottom. And I forgot to mention that our son, when we were Christmas tree hunting one year, got all snaggled up in a snare. And because he has opposable thumbs, we were fine. But it was a rusty old snare. The guy had, if you're laying down 100 snares, are you going to pick up 100 snares? No. So it's also part of the regulatory structure. I'll
Yeah.
shut up now. Sorry,
Yeah.
John. Thanks.
No, I thank you for all that context, especially given that it comes from a family legacy in which trapping was a part of.
Mountain men are a thing of the past.
Yeah.
The people who are doing this for an income, and they can't do it for an income now. They just, but the people that like to romanticize it are not thinking they're driving up a road in an enormous truck or on a four-wheeler. These people aren't skiing in or snowmobiling or snowshoeing in. They're snowmobiling into wild places and wiping out entire populations that hundreds and thousands of dollars have been spent to create a habitat so the critters can be there, and one trapper can wipe out everybody's good efforts.
Yeah. Zack, why don't you speak to, again, briefly, if you can, what's the status, the prospects for banning trapping, snaring on public lands in Montana?
Yeah, I think in terms of banning trapping on public lands, the prospects are pretty low right now. As Betsy mentioned, we had a ballot initiative a few years ago that would have done that, and it failed by about a little over 60% of the Montana public voted that down. And right now in Montana, we're dealing with an incredibly aggressive legislature that is moving a number of bills that would expand trapping in various ways in Montana, and one bill that would even attempt to make trapping an explicit constitutional right. So that's, can be discouraging, but I don't think it means that progress isn't still possible. And I think that in addition to efforts to prohibit trapping on public lands, there are also a number of other potentially more incremental changes that can be made that would still represent progress, like reducing track check times, like expanding setback requirements along trails, et cetera. And I think some of those things will still be possible in Montana and other states in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I thought you spoke when we touched base last week eloquently about, though the goal is not to make trapping better, that any policy change we can make that extends the circle of compassion and care is a good one. So I just want to honor that, because I'm sometimes an absolutist, and I don't want to make trapping better. I want to get rid of trapping, and your comments made me think more deeply about if we can reduce animal suffering by having trap check times exist in the first place and be shortened timeframes, then that can reduce suffering, and that's a good thing. So thank you for articulating that. Want to be mindful of getting to questions from our audience. As always with these panels, we never get to everywhere we want to go. We never answer all the questions. Know that after this panel, we will try to answer all the questions in the chat box. I got a question for you, Chris. You mentioned recently, we've all been watching the Representative Deb Haaland nomination confirmation hearings in the Senate Energy and Natural Resource Committee last week. And your senator, Betsy and Zack, Steve Daines, was questioning Deb Haaland about her comment that traps don't belong on public lands, which actually Representative Haaland made in a Guardians video or some Guardians thing. I'm curious to hear your thoughts first, Chris, and maybe anyone else, about what role the Interior Department and the federal government more broadly through the Biden administration, as opposed to Congress, might play in reforming trapping, and how that might reflect the arc of change that better embodies public sentiment.
Yeah, I'll try not to give too sprawling an answer, because to be honest, Representative Holland's appointment is really, really exciting to me. I was honored to be able to talk to her before she even won a primary to be a congresswoman, and she's just a remarkable person, and her appointment is just thrilling and an awesome opportunity for the U.S. to reimagine public land management on a number of levels. So first, I wanted to say that, and yeah, I think that the quote that Senator Daines pulled up was actually taken from an interview I did with Representative Holland. So that was kind of funny to see. You know, I think in terms of the kind of broad scale reimagining of public lands, trapping fits right into that. And studies show that public lands will best serve Americans culturally, economically, in terms of public health, in terms of sustainability. If recreation and public landscapes are the priorities, but as I discussed earlier, you know, federal and state agencies are still pretty beholden to archaic visions of public lands. So what I would love to see the Biden administration do, or the Department of the Interior do, is take a step back, you know, whether that requires a moratorium on trapping and snaring or not. I think it's worth considering, but do a real thorough holistic study of the best uses of public lands. And again, that's a multidisciplinary thing where you're talking about public health, and you're talking about rural economies, and you're talking about the environment and biodiversity. And my guess is that those studies would show that trapping and snaring does not fit into the best use of our public lands moving forward if we want a long-term vision for the future. And so that's what I would love to see come from the Biden administration, and from hopefully Deb Haaland's Department of the Interior.
Anyone else want to add to that federal perspective?
I would love to add that the federal perspective is absolutely crucial in Montana. We need a federal voice. Montana is more conservative now in its political leadership than it's been in my lifetime. We have a governor who believes that people rode dinosaurs, and that's true in his mind. And we have legislators who probably also agree. And where we used to be a purple state, now we're a bright red, and they're having their way with us in the state legislature. And Zack mentioned trying to make trapping a constitutional right. So I say when people talk about returning management to the states, I say, please no, the federal leadership is required here. As several people have commented, the animals belong to us all. And, you know, I get really frustrated because groups that you would think might be more inspired to help with trapping initiatives to make at least regulated in a different way don't support it. So it's really warming to find WildEarth Guardians and Footloose Montana and these other groups that are willing to fight. And, you know, I wouldn't be my father's daughter if I didn't say the only way things change is if everybody speaks up relentlessly. And that's what's going to make a difference. And so reaching out to Deb Haaland and anybody you know in any administrative or judicial capacity, talk to them, let them know what your experiences are.
That's so critical, so critical. Thank you for underscoring that. And I want to remind people that in the chat box, we've had opportunities for people to take action. Zack, did you want to add anything from the federal perspective? And then I want to get closing thoughts with a separate question.
Maybe one thought, and coming back to the fact that the federal government itself does a lot of trapping through the agency Wildlife Services, and thinking that something that's important to understand about that agency is that it acts only at the request of its customers, or as it calls it, their cooperators. And so to the extent that federal agencies like the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, et cetera, are contracting with wildlife services, those federal agencies have the ability to direct wildlife services contractually not to use traps or other lethal methods in addressing human wildlife conflicts or protecting threatened and endangered species or whatever else those agencies might be asking wildlife services to do. So I think that's, another step that, the agencies under a new administration could consider taking.
Yeah, thank you for that. We started with horror stories. They were hard to hear. And I'm glad that everyone was able to stick with us. I want to end with hope. I'm curious if each of you could take a minute to share what makes you hopeful, especially in light of the fact that this is a difficult issue, both emotionally and politically. And I'd like to start with you, Charlotte, then Betsy, then you, Zack, and Chris. What, if anything, makes you hopeful?
I'm hopeful here in my state of New Mexico that we can come together, not only as hunters or trappers, but come together as a humankind to be able to decide the boundaries, what's best for the people in our areas. I'm excited that there is a bill that's being passed. I'm excited about that because then I think that begins the conversation. There are people that I know that do make money off of trapping. And I know that that could be their livelihood. So I know that there are not just that the cut and dry there. I know there are some gray areas that need to be addressed. And I think that that's important, especially getting this bill across, to have all people at the table to be able to make a very educated decision on how the rest of the counties here in New Mexico continue these traditions or not continue them.
Thank you, Charlotte. How about you, Betsy? What makes you
Well,
hopeful?
you don't see very many people wearing fur these days. Bobcats, which used to draw about $500 a pelt, probably and thousands of them have been shipped out of Montana. The buyers for the fur are international, not in the United States. But what gives me a lot of hope, not only is that we're not seeing people wear fur, and Charlotte, while I know some people make money off of it, it's a very tough way to make a living. And I would challenge anyone to say they're making it on $500 a pelt per year. So it's not an income issue anymore. It's a fairness in use of public lands issue. But what gives me hope is that we're having this conversation and that people who initially were not aware that trapping was even still a thing are now engaging. And the more you and I and everyone on this call shines a bright light on it and how they want their resources used differently, we're going to get this changed in my lifetime if everybody lends a shoulder to the wheel. And so don't be quiet and frustrated and say, well, now I'm just overwhelmed. Reach out to just pretty much everyone you know and say, don't you think we ought to do something to make this stop? That's what gives me hope, because I see more people willing to do that now than ever before.
Thank you, Betsy. I'm feeling hopeful. Zack, what about you?
Well, one thing that gives me hope is seeing here in Montana, and I think many other states, an increasing willingness by federal agencies, state agencies, and landowners to do more non-lethal human-wildlife conflict prevention, using things like electric fencing and riders on horseback and scare devices and guard dogs and the long list of other resources available for ranchers and others to use to prevent conflicts with carnivores and other wildlife. And in the years now that I've been in that sphere, I've seen a lot of increased interest in doing that, a lot more use of those measures on the ground. I see that continuing to expand, and I think that work is a way of offering an alternative solution to traps, that we don't have to resort to traps and other lethal means to live with wildlife. And I'm hopeful about that. And I think that work will continue and expand.
Thanks for that, Zach. I think of that as we have this yearning to coexist, and we just need to honor it and support it and continue to call it forth. What about you, Chris? What makes you hopeful?
A couple of years ago, there was a huge study. I think it was a nationwide study about how people's attitudes towards wildlife are changing over time. And especially in the West, more and more people have a view that wildlife is an integral part of who we are and how we live and our communities. And fewer people see wildlife as just something that is there to be used or exploited. And you know, that reconciles really well with what I said at the beginning, which is why I'm invested in this work, which is that we need biodiversity, we need protected ecosystems if we're going to continue to be able to live on this planet. And I think that study shows that people are getting that more and more, and that attitudes are changing. And as I said earlier, policy takes a long time to catch up with shifting values, but those values are shifting or have shifted. And I'm hopeful that those policies will catch up.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you all for all of you, the panelists here, for spending an hour with me to share your grief and share your hope and share all of your knowledge and wisdom about this issue. I've had my own story with trapping, which is one of grief and sadness. And I know that I had a friend who told me once a long time ago, pain shared is cut in half and joy shared is doubled. So when we share those stories, we hopefully reduce the pain. And when we share stories of beauty and hope, we hopefully amplify what it is we want in the world. These are just really, I would say, still challenging times for our nation and the natural world. And for me, the issue of coexistence is one that is so critical because it's really about compassion. And I am hopeful when we see it in each other and we call it forth in each other. And when I think about the rationale and the basis for why we want to coexist, it is really about compassion for one another and for the natural world. So thank you to all of you for embodying that compassion and living it day in and day out. Thank you again to the audience, all the questions. If we didn't get to all of them, know that we will follow up with answers. So thanks again, and we'll do it again sometime in the future with hopefully more progress to share.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.